The sound of blades cutting through the air, the roar of the Viking hordes, and the clash of shields echo across the hills as the troops approach York. The Anglo-Saxon city, sturdy and imposing, looms before them like a sleeping giant, ready to be awakened. But as the Viking leader surveys the wall that separates his army from their destiny, a thought enters his mind. Conquest is more than simply cutting down a people and pillaging their riches. Conquest is about rule, about maintaining control over foreign land that has never before bent to your will. What would it mean for him to be more than a mere marauder? What would it take to turn a military victory into a lasting empire? This is not just a siege. It is a battle for the soul of a people and the future of a new land. The Viking leader feels the pressure of his own legacy, as the northern winds whisper promises of greatness and unexpected challenges. Ragnar the Immortal was born in the wild lands of Jutland, a place where the winds cut through the skin like knives and the snow covered the land relentlessly. The son of Sigurd, a renowned Viking warrior, and Astrid, a wise and fearless woman, Ragnar was raised in the furnace of adversity. From a young age, his life was marked by battles, struggles, and the relentless pursuit of honor, riches, and power. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Ragnar was not content with just being a warrior. He wanted more. He wanted to transform his brute strength into something that would be feared and respected by all, even beyond the Scandinavian borders. At just 17 years old, Ragnar was already known as one of the most fearless warriors in the northern lands. His fame came not only from his skill with the sword or the number of enemies he had defeated, but from his ruthless vision of war. He understood that to be a true leader required more than a sharp sword. He needed to forge the future of his people, to ensure his name was engraved on stone and in hearts, and to build an empire that would endure for generations. He needed to not only conquer lands, but to rule them with the same brutality and cunning he used in battle. Ragnar first demonstrated his leadership on a grand scale in a brutal raid against the eastern kingdoms. Leading an army of over 1,000 warriors, Ragnar attacked the town of Lindisfarne, a prosperous Anglo-Saxon village. But what was supposed to be just another pillage turned into an act of war that would alter the course of his life. In storming the town, Ragnar did more than just plunder its precious goods or destroy his enemies. He also took control of the town and, for the first time, had to face the harsh realities of ruling a foreign territory. There, Ragnar realized that a military victory was not enough to ensure his survival and that of his people. He needed to maintain order and impose his will. But he also needed to understand and manipulate the complex social and political structures of a newly conquered kingdom. Over time, Ragnar adopted the title the Immortal, not only for his ability to survive near-impossible battles, but for his impressive ability to dominate and subdue even the most challenging of cities. The brutality of his tactics made him a formidable adversary, but it was a strategic mind that set him apart from the rest. He did not limit himself to destroying enemy armies. He subdued them with cunning, using the psychology of war to his advantage. His name, feared and revered by many, became synonymous with strength, intelligence, and above all, absolute control. When Ragnar arrived in a new city, fear would run through its streets before he even set foot there. As his troops conquered lands, Ragnar also made a point of leaving his mark. Not only did he destroy the military forces that opposed him, but he also imposed his own system of government based on loyalty and fear. In every territory he conquered, Ragnar established a strict code of conduct, where treason was punishable by death and honor was the most valuable currency. For him, war was not just a way to enrich himself, but a means of establishing Viking supremacy over the rest of the world. His army, immense and fierce, was made up of men who lived and died for Ragnar's honor, almost an extension of his own will. Ragnar's army, also known as the Sons of North, was feared throughout Europe. Made up of warriors trained since childhood, they were ruthless and possessed a blind loyalty to their leader. Ragnar knew how to inspire his men. His tactics were as unpredictable as his ambitions. He not only led, but seemed to anticipate the enemy's moves with uncanny accuracy. It was as if Ragnar had a direct connection to destiny, as if his skill in war was an extension of his own indomitable nature. His soldiers followed him with unwavering faith, believing him to be untouchable, a living legend who would never fall. But Ragnar was not limited to physical violence. He was a master of diplomacy when necessary, manipulating alliances to his advantage. His cunning in negotiations was as legendary as his military victories. He knew that sometimes the best war was the one not fought, and that domination of land came not through strength alone, but through controlling the minds and hearts of its inhabitants. Ragnar often used the strength of his army as a bargaining chip, letting his enemies bow to his power without spilling any more blood than necessary. However, not everyone was willing to submit to Ragnar. Among the conquered lands, there were always those who resisted fiercely, defying his authority and trying at all costs to overthrow his tyranny. And, as always, Ragnar responded with brutality commensurate with the resistance he encountered. When necessary, he did not hesitate to set fire to fields and destroy entire villages, but he always assured that, in the end, what he conquered was not just a land, but the hearts of people who inhabited it. Ragnar understood that the greatest prize for a conqueror was not plunder, but the loyalty of those he ruled. The battle for the rule of York was the culmination of his journey. When he launched his siege against the city's immense wall, he was not only conquering a land, but was symbolically showing the world that he had reached his peak. He did not fear death, but he knew that, to be remembered forever, he must conquer not only with steel, but with his mind. The brutality of his troops was there, but it was his vision of the future that would truly seal his place in history. Ragnar knew that the true conquest of York would not be about killing and plundering, but about ruling, about leaving an indelible mark on the empire he was beginning to forge, a mark that would stand the test of time. The Anglo-Saxon lands trembled before the fury of Ragnar the Deathless and his indomitable forces. No kingdom or stronghold was safe as his army advanced with a force and brutality that was like a gale from the north. Ragnar did not just conquer lands. He destroyed symbols of resistance and created an empire, and each battle he fought became a legend. 3 battles stood out at the height of his rise, sealing his name in history and revealing the true extent of his power. The brutal battle of the monastery, the destruction of the South Saxon city, and the fierce defeat of King Alfred. It was a morning of thick fog when Ragnar arrived with his troops on the coast of Northumbria. The mission was clear: to destroy the monastery of Lindisfarne, a center of religious and cultural power and a symbol of Saxon resistance. The monastery, with its weathered stone walls and towers that seemed to touch the sky, was a seemingly impenetrable fortress. But Ragnar was not afraid of invading a sacred place. To him, nothing was more sacred than his own power. The attack began before dawn. Ragnar ordered his men to surround the monastery, with the Viking ships anchored off the coast. The biting wind and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks formed a symphony of impending destruction. At Ragnar's signal, the Vikings advanced with their long blades and axes, breaking down the monastery doors with a roar that echoed across the land. There was no mercy. The monks and nuns, unable to defend themselves, were cruelly killed, and fire soon consumed the stone buildings, burning sacred symbols and destroying religious books. But for Ragnar, this was more than just pillage. It was a warning. His army, unstoppable and ravenous, made it clear that no place would be safe as long as he sought power. Despite its brutality, this battle also left Ragnar with a quiet reflection. He wondered if the true strength of his leadership was measured solely by the devastation he caused, or by the way he consolidated his power after its destruction. In the case of the monastery, it was not enough to annihilate everything in sight. He needed to make the people of the region bow to his strength, and that meant more than mere plunder. Not long after the monastery's destruction, Ragnar came upon the South Saxon city, a thriving and well-defended metropolis. With its high walls and a population well-trained in defensive battles, the city seemed a worthy challenge for his army. But Ragnar knew that resistance, no matter how fierce, would not be enough to stem the Viking tide. He had to act quickly as always, and his strategy was spot on. The city, which prided itself on its defenses, was unprepared for the Viking siege. Ragnar used cunning. First, he launched a diversionary attack to the west, burning small villages and creating the false impression that the focus of the attack was elsewhere. When the Saxon troops dispersed to protect these villages, Ragnar and his army advanced by a less guarded route. The surprise was total. By dawn, his troops were already positioned at the city gates. When the walls began to be breached, the shock was absolute. Ragnar, with an axe in each hand, led the charge with indomitable fury. The battle turned into a massacre. The people of the city, seized by panic, were unable to react to the overwhelming strength of the Vikings. What followed was carnage, a spectacle of destruction. The streets of the city were invaded by Viking warriors who showed no sign of mercy. Houses were set on fire, markets destroyed, and temples looted. Ragnar, in his quest for absolute power, made a point of not only destroying, but also subduing the local population. He forced the survivors to kneel before him, proclaiming his supremacy over the entire region. The city that had once prided itself on its autonomy was reduced to ruins, and Ragnar knew that once again his name would be remembered forever as the man who destroyed and rebuilt at his own will. The defeat of King Alfred, the impossible victory, the most intense and strategic battle of all, took place against the legendary King Alfred the Great. Alfred, King of Wessex, was renowned for his military wisdom and his ability to lead the Saxon people against the invaders. However, Ragnar knew that defeating Alfred would not be easy. The Saxon king not only had a well-trained army, but also a series of alliances that made him a formidable opponent. However, Ragnar had a secret strategy. He would attack Alfred's weak points without him realizing it. For weeks, Ragnar concealed his movements and spread rumors of retreats and diversions, leading Alfred to believe that his army was preparing to attack another city. When the confrontation finally occurred, Alfred was unprepared. Ragnar, with his forces hidden, surrounded the king and his troops on a small plain outside Winchester. When the Saxons attempted to position themselves, Ragnar launched a lightning attack, surprising the king. The battle was brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. But Ragnar's trick lay in his strategy. He knew that Alfred, despite his bravery, was not as cunning in combat. The result was a stunning defeat for Alfred. His cavalry was shattered, and his forces were scattered, unable to respond to the ruthless Viking style of combat. Despite the king's fierce resistance, Ragnar managed to capture Alfred, humiliating him in front of his men. It was a resounding victory for Ragnar, not only because of the military defeat, but because of the symbolism it represented. He had broken the spirit of one of the greatest Saxon kings in history, and his name would be remembered as the man who brought down the great Alfred. With Alfred defeated, Ragnar prepared for what would be his greatest conquest, the city of York. The siege of York was more than just a battle. York, one of the largest Anglo-Saxon cities of the time, was situated at a strategic point between the north and south of England. Its capture would mean total control of the trade routes and a significant expansion of Viking power. But more than that, Ragnar knew that York represented the heart of the Saxon resistance. Conquering York would break the last remaining symbol of resistance against his ambition to rule all of England. The siege began with a massive assault, with Viking troops raiding the countryside around the city and destroying the surrounding villages. Ragnar and his army advanced with relentless force, breaking down the outer defenses and weakening the Saxon forces that opposed him. But Ragnar knew that to rule York, he could not simply destroy the city. He would need to control the hearts and minds of the Saxons who lived there. And so Ragnar prepared for the final step of his journey, the true conquest of York. The Siege of York, one of the most imposing battles in Viking history, was not just a clash of armies, but a psychological game, a macabre dance between fear and resistance. Ragnar, the Deathless, the great leader, knew that to conquer the city he would need to break not only its physical defenses, but the souls of its inhabitants and soldiers. On each of the 5 days of the siege, his strategy unfolded, and brutality escalated relentlessly. The sound of axes cutting through flesh, the smell of fire and blood in the air, and the screams of pain echoing through the streets of York became symbols of Viking greatness and cruelty. The first day of the siege began at dawn, with the horizon tinged orange and red by the first incendiary arrows fired at York's walls. Ragnar knew that the psychological pressure was as powerful as the sword in his hand, and his first attack was aimed at destabilizing the Saxons' confidence. Throughout the night, his forces had been quietly preparing in the forests and fields surrounding the city. Ragnar did not want a direct attack. He knew that the city was well defended, with a garrison of seasoned soldiers on its walls. His strategy would be to dilute the city's morale, breaking its defenses into small pieces until it was impossible to resist. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the countryside, the incendiary arrows began to fall, a rain of fire that lit up the York sky. The wooden towers began to catch fire, and the flames spread quickly, consuming the first lines of defense. Ragnar watched from afar, his eyes focused and his mind calculating every move, expecting the Saxons to react in disarray. His hope was that panic would grip York, and that without a coordinated response, the walls could be easily breached. The plan was in motion. While the city was ablaze, the Viking troops silently advanced towards the outer gates of York, with their ladders and battering rams. The sound of axes chopping would echo through the empty streets. But Ragnar knew that a frontal assault would be a mistake. It would not be the battle that would decide victory, but the psyche of his enemy. He spread rumors through his spies, leading the Saxons to believe that the real attack would come from the other side. Throughout the day, the Saxons moved back and forth, trying to secure areas where there was no real threat, while Ragnar prepared for final assault that night. As night approached, fear began to spread through the streets of York. The city, once vibrant and full of life, was now in chaos. Panic gripped families and soldiers alike. Ragnar watched from his vantage point, knowing that attacking was no longer enough. He had weakened the spirit of the city, but there was still one vital piece missing from his strategy. As the siege entered its second day, tensions in York were at boiling point. Ragnar, aware that mass resistance was imminent, prepared his troops for the final assault. His warriors, still full of the energy of the first day, advanced through the night with silent steps, like shadows. They were in York, but the city did not yet know how much it had lost. During the early hours of the morning, they raided homes and businesses, destroying food and weapon stores, creating a sense of scarcity and despair. At dawn, Ragnar ordered new fronts to be opened, with more catapults firing heavy stones at the walls. This was not a direct assault on the fortifications, but an attempt to overwhelm the defenders. The city, feeling the heat of the explosions and seeing the walls begin to crack, panicked. But Ragnar knew that the greatest blow would be psychological, and he took full advantage of this. While his troops destroyed the outer defenses, Ragnar sent a force of warriors to spread fear in the heart of the city. They began to launch fire arrows at houses and warehouses of strategic value, hitting the buildings closest to the center. Frightened civilians ran through the streets, fleeing the flames, while the Saxon soldiers were forced to split into several groups to contain the damage. Ragnar smiled as he watched the chaos spread. He knew that, before long, the trust in his own city would become a distant memory. As the second day dragged on, the Viking attacks grew more violent. The walls were being eroded, but what Ragnar really wanted was to dismantle York's leadership structure. As the flames grew and panic set in, he ordered direct psychological attack. Viking guerrillas began capturing prisoners and publicly executing them in the town squares. Heads were cut off. Beheadings were swift and effective, all done brutally, to demonstrate the fate of those who opposed Ragnar. Each dead prisoner was a clear, wordless message that had a devastating impact. The city was in moral ruin, and Ragnar knew that the next phase would be decisive. The third day saw the complete destruction of the Saxon defenses. At dawn, Ragnar ordered a relentless assault. His men advanced on the main gates with catapults that launched giant boulders, shattering the city's stone defenses. Ragnar knew that the city's resistance would no longer hold. The Saxons were losing control, and their forces were fragmented. The brutality of the attack intensified, and every move of the Viking army seemed to crush any attempt at resistance. The city of York, now completely surrounded, had nowhere left to run. The attacks were constant, and the population, exhausted and hungry, began to abandon any idea of fighting. The Saxon army, which had previously seemed invincible, was now adrift, leaderless and without direction. Ragnar once again used the darkness of the night for his attacks, infiltrating houses and attacking in deadly silence. The streets of York were covered in blood and debris, and the screams of pain could be heard for miles around. The greatest moment of brutality occurred on the third day, when Ragnar ordered the capture of a group of Saxon nobles. With the city in total disarray, he gathered them in a central square and, in front of his own troops, had them executed. The scene was immortalized by his men, Saxon nobles, one by one, falling under the Viking axes without mercy. The idea was simple: to break any desire to fight, humiliate the Saxon leaders, and show that there was no room for negotiation. The city was on its last legs, and Ragnar knew that domination was at hand. By the fourth day, York was completely taken. The last surviving Saxons were hiding, trying to escape the brutality of the siege. Ragnar knew that the goal was not just to destroy the city, but to take complete control. In a final move for control, Ragnar sent his troops to capture the survivors and force the civilians to bow before him. He was not just conquering a city, he was conquering the souls of the Saxon people. The streets of York were covered with the bodies of soldiers and civilians, and the smell of death permeated the air. Ragnar pitched his tent in the center of the city and held a huge feast with his men, celebrating their victory over the Saxons. But even in the midst of the celebration, he knew that the city of York was only the beginning of his empire. Ragnar looked out over the city that was now his with an expression of absolute dominion. The flames still burned in many parts, but the blood had been spilled, and the city was now his to command. By the fifth and final day of the siege, York was irreparably destroyed. Ragnar was preparing to consolidate his power. The Viking forces had taken the city, and the resistance had been broken. But Ragnar was not satisfied with destruction alone. He wanted control. He forced the remaining inhabitants to submit to his will and to abide by Viking law. Ragnar was already preparing to expand his conquest, and York, now under his rule, would become the center of his empire. The city was in Ragnar's hands, but the impact of the siege itself would linger for centuries. It was not just pillage or physical destruction that he had achieved. He had subdued the will of the Saxons, and his mark had been left not only in the destroyed streets, but in the broken hearts of his people. After the 5 days of relentless siege and the total destruction of the Saxon resistance, York had been transformed from a proud and prosperous city into a land marked by devastation. Flames still consumed parts of the houses, while the blood of so many Saxon men and women soaked the streets. But even as chaos raged through the city, a new era was beginning. Ragnar the Deathless had not only conquered York, but had shaped it in his own image, destroying what remained of the old order and creating something new, but equally brutal. The city, now under his absolute rule, would be the foundation of a Viking empire that would extend far beyond what anyone could have imagined. With York in control, Ragnar wasted no time. The city would become a living example of Viking power, a center of command and government that would reflect the unstoppable strength of its leader. He knew that if his conquest was to last, it would require more than simply subduing the Saxons. He would have to cement his authority irrevocably, and that meant establishing his own system of government, completely different from the structure that had existed before. Ragnar ordered the eradication of York's ancient authorities, destroying every vestige of Saxon rule. The few Saxon leaders who remained alive were marched to the city's main square, where they were executed in front of a submissive crowd of civilians and prisoners. The Saxon temples and shrines, symbols of a faith that Ragnar neither understood nor respected, were completely destroyed, burned to the ground until nothing remained but ash and rubble. In their place, Ragnar ordered the construction of a massive Viking fortress in the city center, a huge, impenetrable, and impressive stone structure that would serve as both a palace and a center of military power. The sound of hammers and saws echoed throughout York, while the surviving inhabitants were forced to work building their own prison, now ruled by Ragnar and his ruthless laws. York's new government was established quickly and brutally. Ragnar imposed a system of absolute control, in which any act of rebellion or treason would be punishable by death. The Saxons who survived the siege were branded and forced to live under the new rules imposed by the Vikings, while the most loyal of his own soldiers were given lands and positions of power. Ragnar knew that the control would not only be military, but psychological. Every street in York, every corner, every square was now a symbol of his authority. As Ragnar's rule grew stronger, so did York's cultural transformation. The city, which had once flourished under Anglo-Saxon culture, was now steeped in Viking tradition and custom. Ragnar would not allow the Saxons to hide behind their old beliefs. He demanded that his followers embrace the Norse gods, and Viking temples began to be erected in the center of York to replace the destroyed Saxon shrines. War festivals, which had previously been an exclusive Viking practice, now became part of everyday life in York. The city was marked by a new cycle of violent celebrations and sacred rituals, in which death and war were worshipped with immeasurable fervor. Young Saxons, forced to adapt to the new order, were taught to fight from an early age. Ragnar understood that in order to maintain control, the next generation needed to be Vikings. Saxon children were taken from their families and trained in the arts of Viking warfare, learning to wield axes and swords as skillfully as their own conquerors. Ragnar knew that by making York a center of Viking power, he was not only subduing the Saxons, but creating a legacy that would endure for generations. The city of York would now be the birthplace of a new warrior race, shaped in the image of the Vikings. But what Ragnar really wanted was not just to rule York. He dreamed of a Viking empire that would stretch across England and beyond. The city of York would be the starting point for his greatness, a springboard for the conquest of more lands, more cities, and more peoples. Ragnar began sending emissaries and scouts to the surrounding regions, seeking new territories to expand his rule. He knew that the real battle would be to unify the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under Viking rule, and York would become the symbol of the strength and power of his empire. Within months, York became a center of trade and power, its streets bustling with merchants, warriors, and adventurers from all over the Norse world. The slave trade flourished, with many of the surviving Saxons sold as commodities to other kingdoms. Ragnar knew that an empire was built not on warriors alone, but on wealth, trade, and, above all, control. The city was transformed, with new neighborhoods being built, all under the direct supervision of Ragnar and his officers. York's walls, once a thriving city, now became a prison for anyone who dared rebel. Fear hung over the city like an impenetrable fog. Ragnar ruled with an iron fist, but he knew the city needed something more. It needed loyalty. Ragnar the Deathless knew his legacy in York would be eternal. He had conquered more than a city. He had conquered a symbol, and that symbol would live on for centuries. York, now completely dominated, was living proof of his strategic skill and brutality. Ragnar knew that as long as he lived, his empire would expand. But the true test of his leadership would be how his sons and grandsons would rule the city when he was no longer around. And so, with York now firmly under his control, Ragnar prepared for what was to come. More battles, more conquests, and more victories. The world knew that the name Ragnar was not just synonymous with war, but with unstoppable power, a force that nothing could stop. York, now the jewel of the Viking Empire, would be the beacon that would light Ragnar's path to eternal glory. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.